Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf continues the Gemara's exploration of what types of grains and flours could be used to make matzos mitzvah for Pesach. We've already gone through a number of different species of grains and types of grains. Now we're discussing the halachic status of grains, and the two primary sugis here will be Meiser Sheni and Bikurim. Are you allowed to use those? Machlokes Tanaim. And what is the source if you're not allowed to use them? Also Machlokes. Along the way, the Gemara will discuss matzah made with hot water and matzah made with fruit juices, whether you can use those and why you might not be allowed to use them. So first of all, the Gemara brings a brisa which discusses Meiser Sheni. Meiser Sheni is, of course, 10% of the crops left over after everything was given to the Kohanim and the Levim that they need, and you have to take some of that Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim. You have to take that Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim and eat it there, or else redeem it for money. So the Gemara quotes the brisa. The brisa says you cannot use Meiser Sheni to make matzahs mitzvah, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Rabbi Kiva says you can. What's a machlokes? So the Torah calls matzah lechem oni, which is spelled ayin vav nun yud, which is spelled ayin nun yud but pronounced oni. It's spelled oni but pronounced oni. And Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, and therefore it's like from the word aninus, somebody who is a mourner who is between the death of a relative and the burial of the relative. He is called an onain, so we understand the word oni, lachem oni with an ayin, as lachem oni with an aleph, referring to somebody who's in that state of mourning. And therefore the bread, the matzah, should be the type of thing that you can eat if you are in onain. That is not true for Meiser Sheni. Meiser Sheni, it says, has to be eaten b'simcha, when one is joyful. You cannot eat Meiser Sheni when one is an onain, and therefore matzah and Meiser Sheni are exclusive. Matzah's got to be able to be eaten by aninus when one is an onain, and Meiser Sheni is not. So Rabbi Kiva disagrees. Rabbi Kiva says no. The pasuk says matzos a few times. That includes many different types of matzah, and it also includes Meiser Sheni. Says the Gemara. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says that, what do you mean? I just said it says lachem oni. So Rabbi Kiva says that lechem oni is talking about something else. That is not meant to be read as oni. It's meant to be read as ani, a poor person. That it's got to be poor man's food. It shouldn't be rich man's food, meaning it shouldn't be made with wine, oil, or honey in place of water. The Gemara says, well, what does Rabbi Kiva do with the fact that it is pronounced oini? It is spelled ani, but it's pronounced oini. So Rabbi Kiva says that's to teach you something else. That's from the word onem, meaning to answer or to speak. Like Shmuel said, that matzah is something which is oinim over the of harbi. We do a lot of talking over the bread. We say the entire Haggadah. The mitzvah of Magid at the Pesach Seder is said over the matzah, with the matzah there and out. Okay, that's how the drushes work. Now the Gemara says, is it really true that Rabbi Akiva holds that you are not allowed to use matzah which was kneaded with wine, oil, or honey, what's called matzah ashira, a rich man's matzah? It seems to be untrue that he holds. So we have a brisa that discusses that. The brisa is a machlokes about this very type of matzah. Matzah is made with wine, oil, or honey as the binder instead of water. Rabbi Gamliel says you have to burn it. You can't keep it around on Pesach. And the Chachamim say, no, it's okay. But now, what does Rabbi Kiva say? He says, listen, I once spent Yom Tov at Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, and I made them bread, matzah, out of these things, these liquids, wine, oil, and water, and they didn't say anything's wrong. So you see that they hold it, it's okay. And you also see that Rabbi Kiva holds it's okay. The Gemara just finishes off the brisa. There's also a machlokes about, are you allowed to smear the top of the bread with these things? The Tanna Kamma says even though you're not allowed to make bread out of it, you are allowed to smear it. And the Chachamim say you're only allowed to smear the things that you're allowed to use to make the bread with. Now, the brisa ends off and says everybody agrees that you cannot make matzah out of warm water. So, before we get into that, the Gemara says, so what are you going to do with my kasha? You see here, Rabbi Akiva doesn't have a problem with matzah that's made out of these ashirus liquids. So Gemara says it's different. He doesn't have a problem with it as far as being able to eat it the entire Pesach. He holds it's not chametz. But as far as the matzah's mitzvah to use for the mitzvah is matzah the Pesach Seder, that he would not say you are allowed to do. We certainly agree that that is forbidden. The Gemara says, I'll show you that such a thing is true. It says Rabbi Yeshua told his children, on the first day of Yom Tov you should not make my matzah with milk. The rest of Yom Tov you could make my matzah with milk. So you see that there's a difference between the first day and the rest of the days. The Gemara says, hold on a second, how could you make matzah with milk? Don't we have a halacha you're not allowed to make bread that is milchik, because you end up eating it with meat and that would be isser. So the Gemara says, so either you have to change it here and it wasn't milk, it was really honey that he said, or you say that you are allowed to make it with milk, it's just you only allowed to make bread with milk when you are making a small amount of bread, enough to be eaten in one sitting, what the Gemara calls ke'ein and tura, like the eye of a cow, small amount like the eye of a cow. That you're allowed to do because you'll eat it all at once, and you'll remember that it's milchik and you cannot eat it with meat. You will not leave it lying around and come to problematic consumption of that bread or matzah. Okay. Now we focus for a bit on the halacha of using hot water or warm water to make matzah. We had seen in the Brisa that everybody agrees you're not allowed to use warm water. The Gemara questions, you're not allowed to use hot water to make matzah for Pesach, but there are other mitzvahs of matzah. Matzah was used for certain carbon menachos, and it had to be matzah, not chametz. So how come you're allowed to use hot water for that? The concern with hot water is that it makes the fermentation process speed up. So you shouldn't be able to use it for matzahs that are needed for carbon menachos either. So Gemara says it's different. Menachos are made by kohanim. Kohanim are reason. Kohanim are very careful with their mitzvahs, and they will make sure they will be sure that they bake the matzah before it becomes chametz. Therefore, they are allowed to use hot water. Everyone else, we're not so confident. The Gemara asks if we're not concerned that fermentation will happen when kohanim are involved, so then you should be allowed to soak the grain that you're going to use to make the flour for your carbon mincha also. Soaking the grain also involves a risk of becoming chametz. You got to watch it carefully. But soaking the grain is very helpful. You're able to take off the husks without having them mixed into the flour, and you'll have much cleaner, finer flour. So if the kohanim are involved and that makes things okay, you have less concern that it'll become chametz by mistake. You should allow them to soak the husks. The Gemara says the problem is that the stage of making flour could be done by a Yisrael. Carbon menachos, you have to take the grains, you have to grind them up, make the flour, you have to mix them into water, make the dough, then you have to bake the bread, and then you have to mix pieces of bread with oil. So that can be done, the soaking can be done by a Yisrael. He just has to bring flour. He doesn't have to have the Kohen bringing the flour. The grinding doesn't have to be done by a Kohanim. Yisrael could just bring flour. If that's the case and you allow soaking, Yisrael could do it. So Gemara says, well, the truth is that the kneading could also be done by a Yisrael. The Kohen doesn't have to be involved until the actual kamitza, until he takes off a part of the bread to put on the mizbeach, and then everything else before that, which is the grinding, the pouring, the mixing, the oil mixed in with the pieces of the bread, all that could be done beforehand by Yisrael. So Gemara says, we're back to the problem then. So you shouldn't allow hot water to be used for carbon mincha, because the mixing of the water into the flour could be done by Yisrael. Gemara says the difference is as follows. The grinding doesn't have to be done in the Beis HaMikdash at all. The mixing of the flour into the water, that, even though it could be done by Yisrael, has to be done in the Beis HaMikdash. So it may not be done by Kohanim, but there are Kohanim around, and therefore we are secure that it'll be done correctly. That's why we allow you to use hot water for that. But we wouldn't allow you to soak the grains in water, and we wouldn't allow you to use hot water for matzahs. Those are given over to Yisrael and not in the Beis HaMikdash. Says Gemara, but what about the carbon ha'omer? The carbon ha'omer where they took the barley grains and they made it into a carbon mincha, they ground it up and brought it as a carbon. So over there, the halacha is that you are allowed to soak the grains beforehand. How come you're allowed to do that? That also doesn't have to be done in the Beis HaMikdash, so you should have the same concern that it'll be done incorrectly and it'll become chametz. So my answer is that's different. Even though there you don't have kahanim, that is a carbon tzibor. That is a large group of people working on the carbon together. The Beis Din is involved. We're confident that they'll do it correctly without it becoming chametz. The Gemara now moves on to discuss Bikurim. Bikurim is similar to Meiser Sheni in the sense that both of them have to be brought to Yerushalayim and eaten there, or they could be redeemed and their value brought there and eaten there. The Gemara here discusses that you're allowed to make matzah out of bikurim, and here Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Kiva agree that you cannot use bikurim to make matzah. However, they argue as to what the source is. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says the source is from the fact that it says b'chol ma'ishvayseichem teichlu matzah, you have to be able to eat it in all your residences. Bikurim cannot be eaten in all your residences. Bikurim can only be eaten in Yerushalayim. The Gemara will ask later why that doesn't apply to Ma'aser Sheni as well. But Rabbi Kiva has a different source. Rabbi Kiva says the source is from the fact that the Torah says al matzos u'morim yachluhu, we link matzah and maror. Just like you will never have maror bikurim issues, because bikurim can only be brought from the 7 special fruits, which includes wheat and barley and 5 other fruits, but there are no maror vegetables involved in bikurim. Therefore, just like maror can never be bikurim, matzah can never be bikurim. So the Gemara says, well, if that's true, you should say, you should take that comparison further. Just like maror can only be from plants that cannot possibly even ever be bikurim, maybe matzah should also be from plants that could never possibly be bikurim, which would mean that matzah can't be made out of wheat or barley, because those could theoretically have bikurim from that grain, from that species, from that plant. So Gemara says we don't go that far, because the Torah says matzos, extra word matzos. We include many different types of matzah, and therefore we include grain, we include wheat and barley, that you are allowed to make matzah from them. That limits the drasha. So says the Gemara, well, if that's true, you have that drasha, so then you should also include bikurim itself. Why are you only including things which could theoretically be bikurim? Include actual bikurim. So Gemara says you're right, and Rabbi Kiva actually changed and does not hold of this drasha in the final decision. He actually holds of Rabbi Aglili's drasha that it's from B'chol Moshe V'Seichem. The Gemara says I'm going to show you that Rabbi Kiva really changed. I'll show you a brisa, which has a lengthy discussion of using Meiser Sheni and Bikurim. It clearly holds that you are allowed to use Meiser Sheni, so it's got to be Rabbi Akiva, because we'd seen earlier that Rabbi Aglili says you can't use Meiser Sheni for matzah, and Rabbi Akiva says you could. So therefore it has to be Rabbi Akiva, and it says clearly that the lima that you are not allowed to use bikurim is from B'chol Moshe V'Seichem. What does the brisa say? So it starts off and says B'chol Moshe V'Seichem. Therefore you have to be able to your matzah has to be able to be eaten everywhere, and therefore that excludes bikurim. Why don't you use that for Meiser Sheni? The Gemara says because matzah's riba. You have an extra. You have the word matzah includes more things. How do you know what to include? Maybe I should include bikurim. Why are you including Meiser Sheni? The Gemara says because the rules of bikurim and Meiser Sheni are slightly different. Bikurim is more restrictive. Bikurim, once it's brought to Yerushalayim, can never be eaten anywhere else. You cannot redeem it once it comes to Yerushalayim and then go eat that actual fruits back in outside Yerushalayim. Meiser Sheni, there is a way that you could. If you bring Meiser Sheni fruits to Yerushalayim and they become tamei, then you can redeem them and take them home and eat them over there. So since it's in some way less restrictive, if I have to include one thing in the limitation of Moshe V'Seichem, B'chol Moshe V'Seichem Teichlu, I'm going to include bikurim, which is I'm going to include Meiser Sheni, which is more applicable to other places. I'm going to exclude bikurim, which has less permissiveness when it comes to being eaten outside Yerushalayim. Now, this has got to be Rabbi Akiva, like we said, because he allows Meiser Sheni, and it clearly says that the source that bikurim is forbidden is from B'chol Moshe V'Seichem. The Gemara asks, isn't it strange that Rabbi Yossi Aglili has a whole separate source for bikurim? Why doesn't he use the same source to exclude bikurim from being matzah that he used to exclude Meiser Sheni from being matzah? Meiser Sheni he excluded because an einin is not allowed to eat it, and it has to be besimcha. Why don't you say the same thing for bikurim? Bikurim has to be brought besimcha, and therefore an einin is not allowed to eat it, and matzah has to be something which an einin is allowed to eat because it's called lechem eini. So Gemara says because Rabbi Yossi Aglili doesn't hold that way. Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds that an einin is allowed to eat bikurim, and it's actually machlokes the Chachamim and Rabbi Shimon, and he holds like Rabbi Shimon, who says that an einin is allowed to eat bikurim. What's a machlokes about? There is a pasuk which links Meiser Sheni and bikurim, and it also calls bikurim truma. It calls it trumas yadcha. the pasuk says leisuchal lecha b'sharecha ma'aser degancha v'sirecha v'yitzarecha v'charis bekarcha v'saincha v'chol nidarecha asher tadir v'nid v'yisecha u'surmas yadecha. Surmas yadecha refers to bikurim. It's called surmas yadecha because you have to put it in the kohen's basket. So Gemara says the Chachamim say it's linked to ma'aser, just like ma'aser can't be eaten by an onein, bikurim can be eaten by an onein. Rabbi Shimon disagrees. He says it's called truma. Truma is allowed to be eaten by an onein, and therefore bikurim is allowed to be eaten by an onein. That's why it couldn't be a source, because it qualifies as matzah. It is eatable. It is edible. By an onein, it counts as lechem oni. So Gemara says, but how could Rabbi Shimon say this? Doesn't Rabbi Shimon see that it says right after, it says v'samachta b'chol hatayv? It says you're supposed to be joyful, and it's describing bikurim. So the Gemara says that's to tell you something else. Even though it says v'samachta b'chol hatayv, you have to be joyful, which would seem to indicate that an oinen can't eat it. That's not what it means. V'samachta b'chol hatayv means it should be brought at the time of simcha. What's the time of simcha? From Shavuos until Sukkot is when harvesting happens. People are joyful when they're harvesting. They're happy with their work. That's when you should bring bikurim. From Sukkot until Chanukah, you should not bring bikurim because that's not a time of harvesting. And from Chanukah until Shavuos, you certainly can't bring bikurim at all because it's not even a crop that's available in the field. Okay, now the Gemara brings a brisa which more specifically discusses the halacha of matzah ashira. You can't have rich man's matzah; it has to be poor man's matzah. So the brisa says that the halacha is that because the Torah says lechem oini, that has to be poor man's bread, that excludes where the grain is boiled, and it excludes a very large loaf. So the Gemara says those two things are for rich people. So the Gemara says maybe if it has to be poor man's, you would think it has to be the lowest quality black bread, coarse matzah. But no, it doesn't have to be that bad. It could even be very fine, clean flour, as Shlomo HaMelech would be used to, because it says matzah, says the word matzah. A lot of times we include those extra things. So the things that we say that you can't have is where something strange, something especially rich happened to it, like if the grain was boiled or it's a very large loaf. Now, the Gemara uses the word ashisha to refer to a very large loaf. The Gemara says, how do you know that's the word ashisha means? The Gemara brings a pasuk in Shmuel. It says, "V'chalek l'chol ha'am l'chol hamon Yisrael." They gave out to all the Jews and men and the women chalas lechem machas, one loaf of challah, ve'eshpar, something called eshpar. The Gemara will define it. Echad, one eshpar, ve'ashisha echas, one ashisha. So the Gemara says eshpar is 1/6 of a cow, an entire 1/6 of a cow, and ashisha is 1/6 of an entire ephah. It's a very large measure of flour grain. And Shmuel disagrees with this. Shmuel says ashisha wasn't talking about grain at all. It's talking about wine, and it means an entire
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.